A homeless man saved a boy's life. Then lawyers arrived with a birth certificate bearing his name. In one breath, a forgotten soul became visible. In another, a family's foundation cracked. The streets had hidden him. The moment exposed him. Between the car's screech and the child's rescue lived a truth no one anticipated, that blood remembers, that heroism demands reckoning, and that sometimes salvation costs everything you thought you knew. Subscribe to witness what comes next. The morning unfolded like any other, the sun spilling honey-colored light across the city's concrete arteries, warming the faces of strangers who move through their routines with the practiced indifference of those who believe the day holds no surprises. The air hummed with the low thrum of engines, the percussive rhythm of footsteps on pavement, the distant wail of sirens threading through neighborhoods like forgotten prayers. People clutched coffee cups and briefcases, their eyes trained on invisible destinations, their minds already 3 steps ahead of their bodies. No one noticed the homeless man sitting on the corner, his back pressed against the cold brick of a building that had long since stopped acknowledging his presence. He had become part of the architecture, another fixture in the urban landscape, as unremarkable as the cracked sidewalk or the faded graffiti declaring someone's fleeting existence. His clothes hung loose on his frame, stained with the evidence of nights spent beneath overpasses and days spent searching for scraps of dignity in a world that had stopped looking at him years ago. The boy appeared suddenly, a flash of movement that disrupted the morning's careful choreography. He was small, perhaps 10 years old, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and sneakers that flashed neon green as he darted between adults who barely registered his passing. His laughter rang out, bright and unaware, the sound of someone who had not yet learned that joy could be dangerous, that carelessness carried consequences. He was chasing something, a ball, a bird, a moment of freedom that felt more important than the rules his parents had drilled into him about watching where he was going. The sidewalk ended and the street began, but in his mind there was no boundary, no line between safety and peril. He stepped off the curb as if stepping into water, expecting the world to part for him, expecting the universe to pause and accommodate his small, urgent need to move forward. Behind him, someone shouted his name, but the sound was swallowed by traffic, lost in the city's constant roar. The car came from the left, sleek and silver, its driver distracted by a phone call or a wandering thought, the kind of split-second inattention that turns ordinary moments into tragedies. The vehicle moved with the confidence of metal and speed, indifferent to the fragile bodies that occupied the same space. It bore down on the intersection where the boy now stood, frozen, his small body suddenly understanding the enormity of his mistake. His eyes widened, his mouth opened in a silent scream, his feet rooted to the asphalt, as if the street itself had claimed him. The driver saw him too late, slamming on the brakes with a force that sent the tires shrieking, that filled the air with the acrid smell of burning rubber. But physics cared nothing for panic or regret. The car continued its forward momentum, closing the distance between chrome and flesh, between a routine morning and a moment that would echo through lives for years to come. Time stretched and compressed simultaneously, the seconds expanding into eternities while also collapsing into a single, terrible instant. The homeless man moved without thinking, his body responding to a call that bypassed conscious decision. He had been watching the street with the alertness of someone who had learned to read danger in the smallest shifts of wind and shadow, who understood that survival required constant vigilance. He saw the boy step into traffic, saw the car barreling forward, saw the mathematics of collision aligning with fatal precision. His legs propelled him forward before his mind could catalogue the risks, before he could consider his own vulnerability or calculate whether he would reach the child in time. His arm shot out, fingers grasping the fabric of the boy's jacket. yanking him backward with a force born of desperation and something deeper, an instinct that predated language, that lived in the marrow of bones and the memory of muscles. The boy's body jerked, airborne for a heartbeat, suspended between the car's trajectory and the man's grip. The vehicle screamed past, close enough that the wind of its passing lifted the boy's hair, close enough that the man felt the heat of its engine against his face. They tumbled together onto the sidewalk, a tangle of limbs and gasping breath, alive when they should have been statistics. The street erupted in chaos, voices overlapping as witnesses rushed forward as the driver stumbled from the car with shaking hands and a face drained of color. People surrounded the boy, checking him for injuries, asking questions he couldn't answer because his chest heaved with sobs and his words came out in broken fragments. His mother appeared, pushing through the crowd with the primal force of someone whose child has been in danger, gathering him into her arms with a ferocity that bordered on violence. Her hands moved over his body, searching for broken bones or bleeding wounds, finding only trembling skin and the rapid flutter of his heart. She looked up, seeking the person responsible for saving him, scanning the faces around her until someone pointed to the corner where the homeless man had retreated. He stood apart from the gathered crowd, his shoulders hunched, his eyes averted, as if he feared being seen now that the crisis had passed. When their gazes met, something unspoken passed between them, gratitude and shame, recognition and distance, the acknowledgement that he had given everything in that moment and expected nothing in return. The boy's father arrived minutes later, breathless and frantic, having received a panicked call that sent him running from his office 6 blocks away. He embraced his son with the careful desperation of someone holding something precious that nearly slipped away, his voice thick with emotion as he whispered promises into the child's hair. Someone recounted what had happened, pointing again to the homeless man who now seemed eager to disappear, to fold himself back into the city's shadows where he belonged. The father approached him, extending his hand, trying to find words adequate to the magnitude of what had just occurred. But language failed them both. The homeless man shook his hand briefly, his grip rough and uncertain, then turned away, muttering something about needing to go. The family called after him, wanting his name, wanting to offer something, money, gratitude, connection, but he was already moving, already becoming invisible again. They watched him go, this stranger who had saved their son, memorizing the shape of his retreating back because it was all they would have. The crowd dispersed, the traffic resumed its flow, and the morning continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. The boy's parents carried him home in a fog of shock and relief, their hands refusing to release him, even as they climbed into the car, even as they drove through streets that now seemed malevolent and unpredictable. The mother kept turning in her seat to look at him, to confirm his presence, to assure herself that his small body still drew breath and that the nightmare playing on loop in her mind was just imagination, not reality. She touched his face, his hands, his knees, cataloguing every familiar detail as if seeing him for the first time. The father drove with rigid concentration, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, replaying the moment over and over. The call, the sprint through crowded sidewalks, the terrible vision of his son surrounded by strangers. They spoke in fractured sentences, unable to complete thoughts, each trying to process what had nearly been lost. The boy sat between them in the back seat, quiet now, his earlier tears dried into salt tracks on his cheeks. He didn't understand why his parents were trembling, why their voices cracked when they said his name. He only knew that something had changed, that the world felt different somehow, tilted on an axis he couldn't name. That evening, the house filled with relatives and neighbors who had heard about the incident, who needed to see the boy with their own eyes, to hold him and confirm that he was whole. They brought casseroles and embraces, offers of help, and repeated retellings of the story, each version slightly different, each narrator adding their own interpretation of what the homeless man's intervention meant. Some called it divine providence, others random chance, elevated by human decency. The boy's grandmother wept openly, clutching his hand as she thanked God and fate and whatever forces had placed that man on that corner at that precise moment. The boy grew tired of the attention, of being passed from lap to lap, of answering the same questions about what he remembered. He escaped to his room eventually, closing the door on the well-meaning chaos, sitting on his bed in the gathering darkness. He thought about the man's face, the way his eyes had looked, not angry or frightening, but sad, infinitely sad, as if saving a life had cost him something he could never reclaim. The boy wondered where the man was now, whether he had somewhere warm to sleep, whether anyone would tell him thank you again. Downstairs, the parents spoke in hushed tones after the visitors had left, reviewing the day's events with the exhausted relief of survivors. They talked about calling the police to see if they could locate the man, about offering him a reward or at least a proper thank you. But they realized they had nothing to identify him. No name, no address, just the memory of ragged clothes and weathered hands and eyes that had seen too much. The mother suggested contacting local shelters, putting up flyers, something to acknowledge the debt they owed. The father agreed, but his voice carried doubt, the understanding that men like that often didn't want to be found, that invisibility was sometimes a choice born of necessity or shame. They decided to wait until morning to approach the problem with clear heads and concrete plans. Neither of them slept well that night. They took turns checking on their son, standing in his doorway to watch the rise and fall of his chest, to listen to the soft sounds of his breathing. Each time they returned to bed, they reached for each other in the darkness, holding on as if contact alone could prevent future catastrophes. The homeless man, whose name the family didn't know, spent that night beneath an overpass where the traffic's hum provided white noise against the silence of his thoughts. He lay on cardboard that did little to cushion the concrete's hardness, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of mildew and previous owners. His body ached from the afternoon's exertion, his muscles protesting the sudden violence of his rescue. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the turmoil in his chest. He kept seeing the boy's face, the terror and then the confusion, the way the child had looked at him as if he were simultaneously hero and monster. Something had cracked open inside him in that moment, some sealed chamber he had spent years fortifying against memory and longing. He had acted without thinking, because thinking would have paralyzed him, would have reminded him of all the reasons he had no right to save anyone when he couldn't save himself. Now, lying in the dark, he allowed himself to remember the sensation of the boy's small body in his arms, the weight and warmth of it, the way it had felt like holding something sacred. He had not thought about his son in years, had trained himself not to think about him, to lock that part of his life behind doors he no longer had keys to access. But the rescue had blown those doors open, and now memories flooded through him with devastating clarity. He remembered the day his son was born, the impossible smallness of him, the way his fingers had curled around his father's thumb with a grip that seemed to contain the entire universe. He remembered the smell of the baby's head, the weight of him sleeping on his chest, the songs he used to sing at bedtime. He remembered, too, the day it all fell apart, the arguments, the addiction, the slow erosion of everything he had promised to be. He remembered the court date, the lawyer he couldn't afford, the judge's words severing his parental rights with the clinical efficiency of someone cutting away diseased tissue. He remembered his ex-wife's face, relief and sorrow mingled as she took their son away. He remembered becoming invisible after that, letting the streets swallow him, because being nothing seemed preferable to being the father who had failed. But today, he had been something. Today he had mattered. The realization sat in his chest like a coal, burning and warm and terrifying. He didn't know what to do with it, this feeling of having been seen, of having done something right in a life defined by mistakes. He wanted to find the boy again, to know his name, to see if he was truly unharmed. But he also feared what finding him might mean, what doors it might open that should remain closed. He had no illusions about his life or his place in it. He was a man society had discarded, and for good reason. The best thing he could do for that boy was stay away, stay forgotten, let the family move forward without the complication of his presence. So he lay there in the dark, beneath the overpass where the city's forgotten gathered, and tried to convince himself that being a hero for one moment was enough, that he didn't need anything more than the memory of having done something good. But even as he thought it, he knew it was a lie. Some hungers, once awakened, refused to sleep again. The knock came early, before the household had fully awakened, before coffee had been made or routines established. The sound was authoritative but not aggressive, the kind of knock that suggested official business conducted by people accustomed to being obeyed. The boy's father answered the door in his bathrobe, his hair still disheveled from sleep, expecting perhaps a delivery or a neighbor with borrowed tools to return. Instead, he found two lawyers standing on his porch, both dressed in dark suits that seemed too formal for a weekend morning, their faces arranged in expressions of professional neutrality. They introduced themselves with business cards that bore the names of firms the father vaguely recognized, places that handled estates and trusts and matters far removed from his middle-class concerns. He blinked at them in confusion, his mind still foggy, unable to piece together why such people would be at his door. The taller of the two lawyers, a woman with silver hair pulled into an elegant knot, asked if they could come inside. Something in her tone suggested this was not a request that could be easily refused. The mother joined them in the living room, wrapping her cardigan tighter around her body, as if the fabric could protect her from whatever was coming. The boy remained upstairs, still sleeping, unaware that the trajectory of his life was about to shift again. The lawyers sat on the edge of the sofa, their briefcases placed with careful precision on the coffee table. The woman lawyer did most of the talking, her voice measured and calm, designed to deliver difficult information without causing unnecessary panic. She explained that they represented an estate, that there had been a recent development requiring immediate attention. The parents listened with growing bewilderment, exchanging glances that communicated their shared confusion. They had no wealthy relatives, no inheritances waiting in the wings, nothing that would explain why lawyers would arrive unannounced on a Sunday morning. The father asked what this had to do with them, his voice carrying an edge of impatience born of anxiety. The lawyer reached into her briefcase and withdrew a document, a single sheet of paper that she placed on the table between them. It was a birth certificate. The mother picked it up with trembling fingers, her eyes scanning the official stamps and typed information. She saw her son's name, the name they had given him, the name she had whispered to him every night for 10 years. But beneath it, in the section reserved for paternal information, was a name she didn't recognize. The father leaned over her shoulder, reading the same words, his brow furrowing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The lawyer's voice continued, explaining that this certificate was the original, filed at the time of the boy's birth, before the adoption had been finalized. The name listed as the father was not the man who had raised the child, not the man who had taught him to ride a bike and attended his school plays. It was someone else entirely, someone whose existence had been erased from their family's narrative so completely that they had forgotten he ever existed. The mother's hands began to shake, the paper fluttering between her fingers. She looked up at the lawyer, her voice barely above a whisper, asking what this meant, why they were showing her this now. The male lawyer spoke for the first time, his voice deeper but equally professional. He explained that the man named on the certificate had recently come to their attention through unusual circumstances. He had saved a child from being struck by a vehicle, an act that had drawn brief media coverage and social media attention. Routine investigation conducted by their firm, which had been searching for this man for some time in connection with a separate legal matter, had identified him through witness descriptions and street camera footage. Further research had led them to discover that the child he had saved was, in fact, his biological son. The room went silent, except for the ticking of a clock on the mantel and the sound of the mother's sharp intake of breath. The father stood abruptly, pacing to the window, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He demanded to know who this man was, why he hadn't been in their son's life, why this was being brought up now after a decade of absence. The lawyers explained that the man was currently unhoused, living on the streets, that circumstances and choices had led to his parental rights being terminated years ago, but the birth certificate remained a legal document, and certain rights, particularly those related to inheritance and biological connection, could not be fully erased. The mother felt the room spinning, the walls pressing inward as the foundation of her family's story cracked and shifted. She had known their son was adopted. That had never been a secret. But the details had been kept vague, sanitized. They had been told the biological father was out of the picture, that there would be no complications, no sudden reappearances. They had built their life on that assurance, had allowed themselves to believe that love and intention were enough to make a family real. Now, a single piece of paper was calling that reality into question, inserting a stranger into their narrative, a man who had been invisible until the moment he had saved their son's life. She asked the lawyers what this meant practically, what they wanted, why they were here. The woman lawyer's expression softened slightly, a crack in her professional facade. She explained that their firm had been retained to settle an estate, that the homeless man was, unbeknownst to him, the sole heir to a substantial inheritance from a deceased relative. The lawyers needed to locate him, to inform him of his rights. But in the process of confirming his identity, they had discovered his biological connection to the boy. They were legally obligated to inform all parties. The father turned from the window, his face pale, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. He asked what came next, whether this man had any legal claim to their son, whether a decade of love and sacrifice could be undone by genetics and paperwork. The lawyers were careful in their response, explaining that adoption papers were legal and binding, that the man's previous termination of rights meant he could not simply reclaim custody. But they also acknowledged that he could petition the court, could request visitation or involvement, especially if he could demonstrate rehabilitation and stability. The inheritance he was about to receive would certainly help establish that stability. The implications hung in the air like smoke, obscuring the clear lines that had defined their family. The mother stood, walking to the stairs, needing to check on her son, to see him sleeping in his bed, to reassure herself that he was still hers. She paused at the bottom step, turning back to the lawyers with a question that felt both necessary and impossible to ask. Did the homeless man know? Did he understand that the boy he had saved was his own child? The lawyers shook their heads. He had no idea, not yet. The boy woke to voices downstairs, muffled but urgent, carrying the particular tension that told him something was wrong even before he opened his eyes. He lay in bed for a moment, listening to the cadence of adult conversation punctuated by long silences, the kind that stretched and strained until someone finally broke them with words that seemed to cost something to speak. He pushed back his covers, padding to his door in bare feet, opening it just enough to let sound travel more clearly upward. He heard his mother's voice, higher than usual, threaded with something that might have been fear or anger or both. His father's responses came in bass notes, trying to be reasonable, trying to impose logic on a situation that defied it. There were other voices too, unfamiliar ones, speaking in the measured tones of people who dealt with difficulty for a living. The boy didn't understand the words, but he felt their weight, felt the way they pressed down on his home like a gathering storm. When he finally descended the stairs, the conversation ceased abruptly, all adult eyes turning toward him with expressions carefully rearranged into approximations of normalcy. His mother rose immediately, crossing the room to embrace him with an intensity that confused him. She asked if he had slept well, if he wanted breakfast, her words tumbling over each other in her haste to redirect attention away from whatever had been discussed before his arrival. The boy looked past her, to the strangers on the sofa, to the papers spread across the coffee table, to his father standing by the window with his jaw clenched and his shoulders rigid. He asked who the people were, what was happening, why everyone looked like someone had disappeared. His mother exchanged a glance with his father, one of those silent marital communications that children can sense but not decode. She told him they were lawyers, that there was some paperwork about the adoption that needed updating, nothing for him to worry about, but her smile was wrong, too bright and too quick, and he knew she was lying. The lawyers left shortly after, promising to be in touch, leaving behind a wake of disruption that seemed to fill every corner of the house. The parents tried to maintain normalcy, preparing breakfast with mechanical movements, asking about homework and weekend plans, as if the morning's revelation hadn't just rewritten their family's history. But their distraction was obvious, their attention elsewhere even when their eyes rested on their son. The boy ate his cereal in silence, watching them, trying to understand what had shifted. He thought about the homeless man from the day before, the way his parents had wanted to find him, to thank him. He wondered if this had something to do with that, if somehow the man's rescue had created complications no one had anticipated. He wanted to ask, but something in the air told him that asking would break something fragile, would force conversations no one was ready to have. The father spent the afternoon in his study, door closed, speaking in low tones on the phone to friends who were lawyers or who knew lawyers, seeking advice on what rights they had, what protections existed, what moves they should make next. He learned that adoption was generally ironclad, that terminated parental rights were difficult to reinstate, but that biological connections could create gray areas, especially if the biological parent could demonstrate changed circumstances. The inheritance complicated everything. A homeless man with no resources was one thing, but a biological father with means and stability was another. The father made notes, listing options and worst-case scenarios, trying to build a wall of legal strategy around his family. But beneath the practical planning, fear churned in his gut. He had failed to protect his son from a car, had stood helpless while a stranger acted. Now he feared failing again, being unable to protect him from a different kind of threat, the biological claim of blood that might supersede the claim of love. The mother sat in the boy's room while he played, watching him build structures from blocks and create worlds from imagination, trying to memorize every gesture and expression. She wondered what he would think when he learned the truth. When the sanitized adoption story they had told him gave way to the complicated reality of his origins. They had always planned to tell him more when he was older, when he could understand nuance and complexity. But now, the timeline had been stolen from them, the revelation no longer theirs to control. She imagined lawyers and judges inserting themselves into her son's life, forcing him to spend time with a man he didn't know, disrupting the security they had worked so hard to build. She imagined him asking why they hadn't told him, why they had kept secrets, whether they had been ashamed of where he came from. The questions she imagined felt like accusations, and she had no answers that seemed adequate. She had loved him from the moment he was placed in her arms, had considered him hers in every way that mattered. But the law didn't care about love, only about documents and blood and rights. That evening, after the boy had been put to bed with extra stories and extra time tucked in, the parents sat together in the darkened living room, not touching, each lost in their own spiraling thoughts. The mother finally broke the silence, voicing the fear that had been growing all day. What if the man wanted his son back? What if the inheritance gave him the resources to fight them in court, to present himself as rehabilitated and worthy? The father had no reassuring answer. He knew that stranger things had happened, that courts sometimes prioritized biological connection, that their son's wishes, assuming he was old enough to voice them, might not carry the weight they hoped. They talked about moving, about disappearing before the situation could escalate, but even as they said it, they knew it was fantasy. They were law-abiding people, rooted in jobs and community, unable to simply vanish. They talked about fighting, about hiring the best lawyers they could afford, about defending their family with every resource they had. But that too felt inadequate, a battle they weren't sure they could win. They sat in the darkness, holding their fear between them like a third presence, and wondered how a single moment of heroism had become the thing that threatened to dismantle everything they had built. The homeless man learned about the inheritance on a Tuesday afternoon, standing in the offices of a legal firm that occupied 3 floors of a downtown building he had never imagined entering. He had been found by a private investigator, tracked through the viral video of the rescue that someone had captured on their phone, contacted through a shelter where he sometimes stayed when the weather turned brutal. The lawyers had been insistent, almost desperate in their need to speak with him, and he had come more out of curiosity than hope, expecting some kind of scam or misunderstanding. But the woman lawyer with silver hair had shown him documents, family trees, death certificates, all pointing to an uncle he barely remembered, a man who had disappeared into wealth and isolation decades ago. The uncle had died without other heirs, and the estate had been searching for living relatives. The amount mentioned made the homeless man laugh, a bitter sound that echoed wrong in the wood-panelled office. Numbers that large didn't feel real, didn't seem to have any connection to the life he lived on concrete and cardboard. But the lawyers were serious, explaining investment accounts and property holdings, trusts that would provide income for the rest of his life. They talked about access and disbursement schedules, about requirements and restrictions designed to protect him from himself. They wanted to know about his plans, about whether he had housing in mind, whether he needed rehabilitation services, whether there were people he wanted to notify. He sat in the leather chair feeling like an imposter, his unwashed clothes and unkempt hair absurd against the office's polished surfaces. He didn't tell them about his son, about the boy he had lost years ago to his own failures and the system's judgment. He didn't mention that the child he had saved days earlier haunted his dreams, that he saw the boy's face every time he closed his eyes. Some compartments in his mind needed to stay sealed, at least until he could process what this sudden wealth meant for the ruins of his life. The lawyers told him to take time to consider his options, but also to understand that they needed decisions soon, that estates couldn't remain in limbo indefinitely. He left the building in a daze, walking streets he had walked 1,000 times, but which now looked different, as if the knowledge of money in his name had altered the city's geometry. He found himself at the corner where the rescue had happened, standing on the exact spot where he had lunged forward, where his hands had grasped the boy's jacket. He wondered if fate was linear or circular, if every action carried consequences that rippled forward and backward through time. He had saved a life, and somehow that act had led lawyers to find him, had led him to money that could rebuild what addiction and bad choices had destroyed. But money didn't erase the past. It didn't give him back the years he had lost or the person he had been before. Everything fell apart. He thought about his son, his real son, the one he had held as an infant, the one whose absence had carved a hole through his center that no amount of wealth could fill. He wondered where that boy was now, whether he ever thought about his biological father, whether he knew the whole story or only the sanitized version adoptive parents typically told. The lawyers had mentioned paperwork from his past during the verification process, documents they had needed to confirm his identity. They had seen his history, the arrests, the rehab stints, the termination of parental rights that had been filed in family court a decade ago. They hadn't asked about it directly, maintaining professional discretion, but he had seen the knowledge in their eyes, the careful way they avoided certain subjects. He wondered what they thought of him, this man who had once had a family and had lost it through spectacular failure, who had lived on streets like a ghost, who had somehow stumbled into heroism and inheritance simultaneously. He didn't know how to reconcile these versions of himself, the father who had failed, the homeless man society ignored, the rescuer people wanted to celebrate, the heir to wealth he hadn't earned. They seemed like different people, split across time and circumstance, unable to occupy the same body without tearing something essential. That night, in the motel room the lawyers had paid for as a temporary measure, he lay on a bed that felt too soft, too clean, too far removed from the concrete and cardboard he had grown accustomed to. The room's silence was oppressive after years of sleeping where traffic and voices provided constant soundtrack. He stared at the ceiling, thinking about choices and second chances, about whether people could truly change or only pretend until the next crisis revealed their fundamental nature. The inheritance meant options, treatment programs that might actually work, housing that could provide stability, the possibility of becoming someone his younger self might have recognized, but it also meant exposure, visibility in a world he had learned to navigate through invisibility. People would know his name, would have opinions about what he deserved and didn't deserve, would judge whether a homeless man should inherit wealth earned by someone else. He thought about the boy again, the one he had saved, wondering if that child had any idea how his rescue had set so many things in motion. The realization came slowly, building through the night like water filling a vessel drop by drop. The timing was too precise, the coincidence too exact. The boy he had saved, the lawyers tracking him down, the documents they had reviewed. Something connected these things beyond random chance. He sat up in bed, heart racing, mind assembling pieces he hadn't known formed a picture. The lawyers had asked if he had children, had seemed particularly interested in certain dates and locations from his past. They had mentioned adoption records during their identity verification. The boy he had saved had been about the right age, had been in the right city, had had that particular look that had stirred something deep in his gut, even as he lunged forward. He grabbed the documents the lawyers had given him, spreading them across the motel bed, searching for confirmation of what his instincts were screaming. And there, buried in the legal language and cross-referenced files, he found it, a birth certificate bearing his name and the name of a child who had been removed from his custody years ago. The boy he had saved was his son. The universe hadn't offered random heroism. It had given him a second chance, disguised as an accident. The lawyers contacted the adoptive parents again 3 days later, this time with new information that made the previous conversation seem like a gentle introduction to coming devastation. The homeless man, who now had a name they could speak, who now had resources that changed every calculation, knew. He had figured out the connection between the boy he had saved and the child he had lost. He wanted to meet his son, not as a stranger who had performed a heroic act, but as a father reclaiming a relationship that had been severed but never fully dissolved. The lawyers presented this information with careful neutrality, but the implications were clear. This was no longer a theoretical complication, but an active threat to the family's integrity. The man had hired his own legal representation, was preparing to petition the court for visitation rights, was arguing that changed circumstances, specifically His newfound financial stability and the dramatic rescue that demonstrated his character warranted a re-evaluation of his terminated parental rights. The adoptive parents listened in stunned silence, the ground shifting beneath them again, faster now, accelerating toward a collision no one could prevent. The mother's first instinct was to refuse, to build walls so high and thick that no legal argument could breach them. Her son was not a possession to be claimed by someone who had abandoned him through addiction and neglect. Biology didn't erase a decade of bedtime stories and school pickups, of scraped knees, kissed, and nightmares soothed. She had earned her place as this child's mother through daily presence, through showing up year after year when the biological father had been too lost in his own darkness to find his way home. But the lawyers explained, in their measured professional voices, that family court was complicated, that judges had wide discretion, that demonstrated rehabilitation combined with biological connection could create outcomes the parents wouldn't like. The man's inheritance wasn't just money, it was proof of stability, evidence that he could provide materially for a child. His rescue of the boy wasn't just heroism, it was a demonstration of instinct and sacrifice that courts might interpret as evidence of paternal bond. They were no longer fighting a homeless man with nothing to offer. They were fighting a father with resources and a compelling narrative. The father tried to approach the situation strategically, consulting with family law attorneys who specialized in adoption and custody battles. They explained that the termination of parental rights was supposed to be permanent, that adoption created a new legal reality that superseded biological connection. But they also acknowledged exceptions and loopholes, ways determined biological parents, with improved circumstances, could petition for renewed contact. The standard was always the child's best interest, a vague phrase that different judges interpreted differently. Some prioritized stability and existing attachments, favoring the adoptive family. Others believed in the importance of biological connection, thinking children deserved to know their origins and maintain relationships with blood relatives when possible. Everything would depend on the judge assigned to their case, on the specific arguments made, on whether the biological father could convince the court that his presence would enhance rather than disrupt the boy's life. The father made lists of arguments and counter-arguments, documented every aspect of their son's development and happiness, prepared for a battle he had never imagined fighting. The boy sensed the escalating tension, the way his parents' attention had become fragmented and distant, the way they whispered urgently when they thought he couldn't hear. He asked directly one evening what was wrong, why everyone seemed scared, whether he had done something to cause this change. His mother pulled him close, assuring him he was perfect, that adult problems sometimes complicated things, but that he was loved and safe. But her words rang hollow against the fear in her eyes. The father suggested they tell him something, prepare him for what might come. But the mother resisted, wanting to preserve his innocence for as long as possible, hoping the legal battle could be resolved before it ever touched their son directly. But hope was becoming a scarce resource, rationed carefully as they moved deeper into a situation none of them controlled. The biological father, whose name was Michael, though the boy didn't know it yet, sat in meetings with his own lawyers, planning how to introduce himself to a son who had no memory of him. He understood the adoptive parents' fear, understood their desire to protect the child from disruption, but he also believed he had rights that transcended his past mistakes, that the decade he had lost shouldn't erase his identity as this boy's father. The inheritance had given him resources, but it was the rescue, that split-second decision to lunge into traffic, that had given him purpose. He had saved his son without knowing it was his son, proof that some connections existed beyond conscious knowledge, that blood called to blood even when names and faces had been forgotten. He wasn't trying to steal the boy from the only family he knew. He just wanted a chance to be part of his life, to prove that people could change, that redemption was possible even after spectacular failure. His lawyers filed the necessary paperwork, petitions that would force a judge to consider whether a terminated father could become a present one. The court date arrived like an executioner's appointment marked on calendars with dread and preparation. The courtroom was smaller than the parents had imagined, less dramatic than television had led them to believe, just wood paneling and fluorescent lights, and a judge who looked tired before proceedings even began. Both sets of lawyers presented their arguments with practiced efficiency, laying out timelines and precedents, facts and emotional appeals. The adoptive parents testified about the boy's life, his happiness, his stability, the fear that introducing a biological father would shatter his sense of identity and security. Michael testified about his journey from addiction to homelessness to unexpected wealth, about the rescue that had been instinct rather than recognition, about his desire not to replace but to supplement, to be present in whatever capacity the court deemed appropriate. The judge asked questions, made notes, promised to review everything carefully before issuing a ruling. The parents left feeling hollow, uncertain, as if they had just surrendered their son's future to a stranger in robes who would decide based on legal principles rather than love. They drove home in silence, each imagining worst-case scenarios, neither willing to voice them aloud for fear of making them real. The judge's ruling came 3 weeks later, delivered in a written decision that attempted to balance competing claims of love and law, biology and belonging. The court acknowledged the adoptive parents' decade of devotion, recognized their son as fundamentally theirs through daily presence and sustained care, but the ruling also found that Michael's dramatically changed circumstances, combined with his biological connection and the rescue that demonstrated instinctual protective behavior, warranted supervised visitation. The boy would meet his biological father in controlled settings, with a court-appointed therapist present, with the frequency and duration increasing gradually based on the child's comfort level. The adoption would remain intact, the parents' legal status unchanged, but Michael would be granted a role, undefined but undeniable in his son's life. Neither family got everything they wanted. Both got more loss than they had bargained for. The first meeting was arranged at a neutral location, a family counseling center with bright walls and toys designed to make difficult conversations easier. The boy arrived with his parents, confused about why he was there, still not fully understanding the situation despite careful explanations that tried to prepare him without frightening him. He knew only that he was going to meet someone important, someone connected to his adoption, someone his parents weren't entirely comfortable with, but whom the law said he should know. When Michael walked into the room, cleaned up now, his hair cut and his clothes new, the boy felt a flicker of recognition. He had seen this man before, though he looked different, without the layers of grime and exhaustion that had defined him on the street. The therapist made introductions, using words like biological father that meant little to a 10-year-old whose understanding of family was simpler and more immediate. Michael sat across from his son, separated by space and time and choices that couldn't be undone, and tried to find words adequate to the moment. He told the boy about the day he was born, about holding him when he was just hours old, about the hope and terror of becoming a father. He told him about making mistakes, about losing his way, about years spent trying to forget because remembering was too painful. He told him about the rescue, about recognizing something in that moment that his conscious mind hadn't yet understood, about how saving the boy's life had saved his own in ways that had nothing to do with inheritance or money. The boy listened with the particular stillness of children processing information that reshapes their understanding of the world. He asked questions that were both innocent and cutting. Why did you leave? Where were you? "Did you think about me?" Michael answered as honestly as he could, not hiding his failures, not making excuses, just offering truth and the raw hope that truth might be enough to build something new. The adoptive parents watched through a one-way mirror, the therapist having suggested they stay close but invisible for this first meeting. The mother wept silently, watching her son's face as he absorbed information about origins she had hoped to deliver differently, on a timeline she controlled. The father held her, his own eyes fixed on the man across from their son, searching for signs of manipulation or danger, finding instead something more complicated: genuine remorse, careful hope, the unmistakable pain of someone trying to bridge an unbridgeable gap. He didn't know whether to hate Michael for disrupting their family or to be grateful that the man had saved their son's life. Both emotions seemed equally true and equally impossible to sustain. The visits continued, weekly at first, then twice a week, the therapist gradually removing herself from the room as the boy and Michael built something tentative and fragile. They talked about school and sports, about favorite foods and movies, searching for common ground in the mundane because the profound was too overwhelming. Michael learned his son's laugh, the way his nose wrinkled when he was confused, the particular slump of his shoulders when he was tired. He learned to navigate the complicated reality of being present without claiming ownership, of offering love without demanding it be returned. The boy remained guarded but curious, testing the boundaries of this new relationship, trying to understand how one person could be both stranger and father, both rescuer and someone who had once walked away. The adoptive parents adjusted to shared custody of their son's attention, if not his time, learning to make space for Michael's presence even when it hurt, even when it felt like loss. Months passed, then a year, the new configuration slowly solidifying into a sustainable, if imperfect, arrangement. The boy spent occasional weekends with Michael, visits that felt more like time with a distant uncle than a father, but which gradually accumulated into something resembling connection. He called Michael by his first name, unable or unwilling to use the title Dad that still belonged exclusively to the man who had raised him. Michael accepted this, understanding that some designations had to be earned through presence, that biology alone didn't grant him the identity he had forfeited. He bought an apartment, furnished a room for his son, created a space that existed whether or not the boy ever felt comfortable enough to sleep there. He attended school functions, sitting separately from the adoptive parents but present nonetheless, watching his son in school plays and soccer games, learning the rhythms of a childhood he had missed. The family learned to exist in this fractured wholeness. None of them fully satisfied, but all of them adapting because the alternative, continued legal battle or complete separation, seemed worse. The boy grew into the complexity, developing a more nuanced understanding of family as something flexible and imperfect, held together not by simple definitions, but by effort and intention. He loved his parents, the ones who had raised him, with the complete trust of someone who had never doubted their presence. He was learning to care for Michael, more carefully and cautiously, understanding that this relationship would always carry the weight of absence and recovery, that some losses couldn't be fully restored. But on good days, when the three adults managed to exist in the same space without tension, when his two fathers could share a moment of common concern for his well-being, the boy glimpsed what wholeness might look like. Not the seamless unity he had known before, but something more honest, more complicated, more real. He carried within him the truth that people could fail and return, that rescue came in many forms, and that family was a word with more meanings than he had ever imagined.